Welcome to this evening's lecture. It's a Royal Historical Society sponsored lecture. My name is Emma Griffin. I've met lots of you already today. I'm the president of the Royal Historical Society, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to this event, and also for us at the Royal Historical Society to be here. This is a part of the Brunel Research Festival, a varied programme of activities celebrating how Brunel's research is changing society for the better. And this, as I say, is an RHS sponsored lecture. Every year, the Society visits several academic institutions. We sponsor several lectures inside London, but we also really like to get outside of central London. I know we're still kind of in London, but we're outside of our base that's in Bloomsbury. And we like to visit other history departments, learn more about those departments and the staff and the research that's going on there and the priorities that they have. And as well, we sponsor an exciting, innovative lecture such as we are doing tonight. So this evening's lecture forms the concluding event of a series of visits that we've done, and I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Corinne Fowler to speak about her latest work on how British colonialism has affected rural labour and country life in Britain. Corinne is a professor of colonialism and heritage in the Department of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester. She's probably best known for her hugely influential project that she directed between 2018 and 2022, The Colonial Countryside, National Trust Houses Reinterpreted. It's a child-led history and writing project with 100 primary school pupils and commissioned writers. I also think when you visit National Trust properties today and you see how British colonialism and slavery is manifested in these country properties, you're seeing something that we didn't really see when we visited these properties a decade or more ago. And a lot of that is thanks to Corinne's work. It's a really huge and a really influential legacy. It's a kind of impact that many historians, just their work will never have. And I think it's a real accolade to Corinne that this is what she's accomplished. In 2020, she co-authored an audit of peer-reviewed research about National Trust properties' connections to empire, which you probably may have seen became a major news story. The report itself won the Museums and Heritage Judges Special Recognition Award in 2022 and the Eastern Eye Community Engagement Award in 2023. In addition, of course, Corinne is a very widely published author. Her recent publications include Green, Unpleasant Land, Creative Responses to Rural England's Colonial Collections, which was published by P. Peltry Press in 2020, and most recently, and we will have heard about this in the last session, and I see we've got a pile of books here, Our Island Stories, Country Walks Through Colonial Britain, which was published by Penguin very recently, May 2024. So congratulations, Corinne. And tonight she's going to be speaking on the theme of this latest book. Please welcome me in joining the wonderful Corinne to speak on colonial Britain, Country Walks Through Colonial Britain for this sponsored lecture at Brunel.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me. I'm really, really happy to be here. I'm really embarrassed to say I've never been to Brunel University before, so it's all new to me. And I just wanted to check that you can all hear me fine at the back. Good, perfect. Does anyone know what this house is behind me? I just wondered if anyone might have ventured here before. It's Northington Grange in Hampshire, so it's not massively far away. And I really, in this new book, I've kind of come on a long journey. I as mentioned, have worked on National Trust properties and tried to raise public awareness about existing academic research about National Trust houses and their connections to the British Empire, which bring out all kinds of colonial histories. But I think I'm moving more and more into rural Britain more generally, deeper and deeper into the countryside and into the history of rural life. So I just wanted to kind of talk you through that process and provide a bit of an example of one of my walks from this book. But I think I want to start, since this is a Royal Historical Society lecture, by thinking about the environment in which I wrote this book and the environment that we are operating in if we are dealing with the history of empire, because it's a very sensitive history and it's really quite difficult to talk about without uh, arousing certain amounts of ire. So I I wanted to start by just telling you about something that happened to me a couple of weeks ago. That I was invited onto the Today program to talk about my book. You know, they've always got a little slot of about 6.5 minutes at the end of a program where you get to try and say what your book is all about and why it matters and all that. But it was really quite an interesting interview because it was subtly very hostile interview, and I kind of expected it because of the history of what happened with the National Trust and how sensitive it all was. And one of the questions that got thrown at me, which took me by surprise, so my brain was kind of spinning for a few microseconds, thinking, where did this criticism come from? Was a criticism of my book and the Copper Walk, which is the last of 10 walks in my book, which completely flummoxed me because the book wasn't published yet. So I was really interested in this. And so somebody helped me to find the source of this criticism, which was in The Spectator. This was a Spectator article, and the title of the article is Anti-Colonialism and the Distortion of History. And it's about my book, and it's about my walk before the book was even out. And believe me, we were very careful about who got advance copies of the book. And it was very obvious from reading this article that the person criticising my book had not read my book and couldn't possibly have read my book 8 days before it was released. So one of the things that it's saying is that I didn't say certain things about copper. So one of the things I look at is academic work on the history of copper in Cornwall, because copper used to employ a third of the population. And so that copper was used, amongst many other things, for copper boiling vats in plantations, for copper utensils to transfer the boiling sugar from one vat to another. And it was tons, this is tons and tons and tons and tons of copper. And there are many, many more connections. And one of them is that copper was used to sheathe ships. I don't know if you've heard of the expression copper bottomed. But this was to, as I say in my book, although the article says I don't, it was partly to make the ships faster so they could sail faster across the Atlantic, for example, because they didn't get barnacles on them anymore, and partly to protect them, the hull, from decaying in tropical waters. And I also say in my book, although this article says I don't, that the Navy used this as well because they were busy fighting a lot of colonial wars, and that's why they needed copper-bottomed ships. So I think that this is a really great example of intellectual dishonesty in the name of pioneering historical truth, that we're kind of dealing with this environment where I then had to compose a tweet deconstructing the whole argument and saying that I did say this in my chapter. They couldn't possibly have read my book because I do say this, and it's, you know, my book's perfectly subtle in the way that you say it isn't. So I think that history wars, these are a kind of large part of what we're contending with at the moment. And the only armour we've got really is keeping sane, keeping a kind of calm tone, and not descending into a bun fight, and also, of course, evidence and research rigor. That's all we've got in this, because we don't have the platforms generally that someone who's writing for the Telegraph or the Spectator has. So I think I sort of wanted to introduce that, because another little anecdote before I start diving into the topic of my book was that I was last week in Sheffield, and I saw somebody with their hand up at the end of the talk, and he was sitting right there in the front row. He had red braces, red check shirt, red corduroy trousers, and as soon as he got a chance to ask a question, he started a kind of tirade. of the sort that has become very familiar to me because I had this tirade. I won't go into it, but anyone who reads up about it will know that I had this tirade for a whole year. And it wasn't just trolls on Twitter, it was letters, emails, and threats. And so this man, this questioner, he said, "Your last book, Green Unpleasant Land, it was obviously, just by the title, set out to offend and insult British people." And then he carried on like this for a while, and then he ended his question. He kind of spat out the last bit, and he said, "And would you call yourself woke?" And so the audience kind of held their breath and looked at me, and I had a peaceful conversation with them about that at the end, and tried to kind of calm things down a bit. But I think that it's important to distinguish between deliberate intellectual dishonesty and distortion of the historical record on the one hand, and people who've got big platforms, and people who are genuinely confused by it and manipulated by it. So I think that I'm very keen in talking through evidence-based work, not to weaponize knowledge, because it's important to call people in and to sort of take them with you as far as possible. So this all has an implication about the way in which we do history writing, and my book is very much a response to that. So one of the books I wanted to draw attention to is a book that's coming out soon called The Truth About Empire, which, as you can see from part of the blurb there, it comes from expert historians who want to counter some of this kind of fake history that's coming out of and they're really concerned with making sure that historians' authority as leading professionals should count for something in today's polarized debates over Britain's imperial past, etc., etc. And they talk about this disinformation campaign, and they just go through different aspects of colonial history, and they refute some of the claims that have been made about colonial violence, for example. Anyway, to get back to the Today programme, I was really struck by the fact that I was treated more like a politician and an academic, and that's the kind of world that you end up operating in. And it's a world in which an editor of, say, the Spectator will be absolutely fine with somebody writing an article about a book which hasn't been read, which hasn't even been released yet. And there's so much at stake here. So I think my question is really, can we just publish and leave everyone to it, or do we have a greater responsibility to write our history books in different ways and try new approaches to history writing in itself? So I think that's kind of how my new book came into being. And as has been said, it's a book of 10 walks through colonial Britain, bringing out how different periods of colonial history, different kinds of activities, colonial activities, impacted on, informed, and shaped the countryside and rural life in different ways. So, this book is in many ways my response to the culture wars, not just in its content, but in the way in which I've written it and the way in which I talk about that really sensitive history. I hope we really have to be as emotionally intelligent as we can in this kind of environment in order to deal with the challenges for public historians. So the way I wrote this book is as important as what is actually in it in terms of content. But it is, in terms of content, it's a history book, but it's also about nature. It's about our relationship with nature. It's about also race and the countryside. And it's written in a way which I hope is accessible because, as they say, I don't know if anyone can place this quote, but I really love it. Language communicates, but it also excommunicates. I really want to know the origin of that saying, but I think it's important to remember that because this history belongs to everybody. It doesn't belong to academic historians in any way, shape, or form. So on this walk, one of the ways I wrote it was to choose walking companions, and there are various pictures of my walking companions there. The walking companions, I chose them because I think they're doing important work of one kind or another, and they've made amazing contributions to the areas in which they work, whether they're writers or artists or uh, politicians. And I think that walking seemed an important way of trying to untangle some of these debates and to look at the evidence in the round. Partly because walking is a way of connecting with yourself, it's a way of connecting with others, it's about having conversations while you walk, not shouting, and it's about really reflecting and giving proper space to think about the human dimensions of that history. It's not just a collection of facts, it really, really means something. In terms of where we did the walks, most of my walkers chose the landscapes for us, and then I did the research. And to be honest, after writing this book, I've realised you could pretty much put a pin in any part of rural Britain, and you'll come up with some absolutely unique and amazing colonial connection or series of colonial connections. So it was an incredible experience walking the book. And the way in which I did the research was um, to research the area with very, very local history and find those broader colonial connections, and then to plot a walk of around 7 miles, because I know nobody really likes to walk much more than 7 miles, in kind of almost a chronological history that you could almost read the book while you were walking along. And I found this a really useful way of working anyway, because it's quite a grounded approach to the local landscapes. There are things you realise when you're walking in those landscapes that you wouldn't realise if you were just sitting in reading something in an archive or reading a book about that place. So it was useful. I'll show you why when I talk about one of my walks. But the walk has maps, and this map shows you where this is an overall master plan of where all the walks were. And you can see where I walked from Scotland down to Cornwall and via Wales and so on. And so I wanted to include maps in the book to encourage people to do the walks and to experience those landscapes for themselves. And the landscapes themselves are very much a part of each chapter. So, in terms of the walks, it's really looking at how, as I've said, colonial history is relevant to the countryside all over Britain. So, I've got various walks: a sugar walk, East India Company walk, tobacco walk, cotton walk, and so on. So, one of the walks which uh, I think people quite like is my walk through the lakes, and that's really addressing the history of the Romantic poetry. So it features William Wordsworth, but it's not William Wordsworth the poet, it's William Wordsworth the businessman. And so it really gives you a very different perspective when on Wordsworth the businessman, when you realise how he and his family tried to make money, for example, on opium and through the East India Company and Mississippi bonds later on in his life. So I talk about that when I'm walking through the lakes. And then I have look at the history of trade. So that is really my sugar walk, my tobacco walk. And the tobacco walk is in Whitehaven. I don't know if anyone's ever been there, but it's one of the most dramatic walks because it goes right along the cliff tops. Do not do it on a windy day because you could literally be blown off the cliff top. But that is a very interesting example of how the coastline itself and the built environment, the deep water part of the port for transatlantic ships, the Georgian houses in their faded elegance is all connected to both coal and tobacco wealth. Um, there is the history of finance, which I'll talk about in a moment in my banker's walk. And then there's the history of production and also the Industrial Revolution. I'm looking, sort of drilling down into the history of wool making and its connection to Atlantic slavery and clothing for enslaved people in North Wales, and then drilling down into the cotton famine history with my cotton walk in it, very much very, very local history, and then thinking about how a small mill town of Darwin was really seriously impacted by activity, colonial activity, both in the Confederate States where the cotton was grown, and then also the history of Indian independence and the cotton story there. It's the same little mill town, and the moorland around it was all impacted very much by that. And then I look at history of extraction, so that would be my cotton walk, my copper walk that I've already mentioned, and of course of labour history all the way through. But I've got a labourers walk which focuses on the Tolpuddle martyrs. I don't know if you know the story of the Tolpuddle martyrs, but it's one of the most important British stories of unionisation, when some men joined a agricultural workers' union and ended up in the penal colonies. So I kind of follow part of that story, which isn't talked about so much. And then in terms of labour history, I think it became really important to address a question that I'm asked all the time. You know, why are you obsessed with colonial history? And I suppose the facetious answer would be because I'm employed to research colonial history and that's my expertise. But beyond that, it did make me think that question, because in on one level it was a way of trying to shut down the conversation about colonial history by saying you should talk about the factory system and how cruel it was in Britain and child labourers and all of that. But also I did think about actually how little I also learned at school about the labour history. I didn't just not learn about colonial history. I didn't learn that much about labour history. I don't know if many of you did, but it's obviously absolutely fascinating and really important to understand. So while I was having all this thinking through this, one of my fellow walkers, who's pictured on the right there, Raj Pal, we were having a conversation, staring at his bookshelves as we often do. We spend like half our time looking at his bookshelves, seeing what I can borrow next or what I can lend him next. And he picked out E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class, which is an old classic from 1968. And it's got many criticisms of it, which I won't go into now, but I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to start off this project by reading through this book with a very fine tooth comb. And as I did that, all these colonial figures kept popping up in the book, and then they just receded again because it wasn't his subject, but it was really striking how many governors of Jamaica kept popping up. If you know the names, it all comes out. So I thought that I would then think about how to write a book which doesn't write about either colonial history or labour history, but talks about how both were connected. And so that's the book that I ended up writing, thanks to Raj. So there's due acknowledgement to the brilliant Raj Pal. And one of the ways in which I did this, I'm not going to talk extensively about this walk, but you can see where I walked. I don't know if anybody knows the sort of town stroke village of Bungay, which is on the Suffolk-Norfolk border. But this is one of the walks that I did, which is the Enclosure walk. And the Enclosure walk was really a way of putting together the history of slave ownership on the one hand and slavery profits, and enclosure and the loss of the commons on the other, because the two are incredibly strongly connected, because a lot of enclosure, especially at its peak, coincides with the kind of height of colonial activity, and that is no coincidence. So I demonstrate in this chapter how a lot of people use colonial wealth to privatise the land and throw people off the commons where they used to graze their livestock and even grow things to eat and collect firewood and flagstones for their houses and so on. So I go into that history in that chapter, and one of the things that I would argue is that the history of land ownership is one of the most important legacies of empire in the British countryside because of all the colonial wealth that was coming in the 18th century, particularly, and this is sort of tilts into the early 19th century in this case. So all I would do is just put things together that are not normally put together. So you can see there an entry from the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, Sir William Wyndham Dalling in this case, and then I would put that against the enclosure maps, and you could see what year he got his compensation for enslaved people and what year he bought all his land, and that. So that I explore that in that chapter. Another kind of interesting for Walker's legacy is of all of this land ownership and this buying up of land and privatisation of land and enclosure was that the footpaths were diverted. So even today, if you do that walk, you have to walk the long way round. That is a direct result of imperial wealth being spent on buying up land. And so I sort of show in the route how you have to walk all the way around the Ayrsham estate instead of walking the short way as people used to be able to do. And I think that all of that feeds very well into discussions about land access today that we're having today. So I wanted to kind of to detail a bit more my I can't see the time. I don't know what 5:30, right? Great. To talk about the Bankers' Walk, which is in it's near Winchester in Hampshire, and I think one of the things about this chapter is that it's who I walked with and how he sort of shed light on the history and the meaning of that history. Because a lot of the discussions we have are quite interior to Britain. So we'll talk about colonial history as if it only affected us, but actually there are millions and millions of people who are descended from formerly colonized people who had a far more impact on them to this day than it had on Britain in many ways. Well, in many ways. So I walked with an historian from Senegal, and he is such an interesting figure, and his story is so amazing. What I wanted to do in this walk was to join 3 points of an historical triangle. So there's the history of enslaved people coming from Senegal or the Senegambia area to Louisiana, where Ibrahim Seck, the historian I walked with, is based now. Then there's Louisiana's plantation stories, and then there's Hampshire's finance story, the story of finance. And I wanted to take a closer look at the local landowners and bankers who financed and helped finance, anyway, Louisiana's plantation system. So Ibrahim, as I say, he's got a really amazing story because he was originally a teacher from the capital of Senegal, and he went on an exchange visit to Louisiana, and he heard an old Delta blues song. And when he heard it, he immediately thought, this is Senegalese. How come? And it took him on a whole journey. He became one of the foremost researchers of Louisianan slavery history, plantation history. And he basically he looked at lots of archival documents, and in Spanish, in English, and in French, and he managed to piece together the stories of individuals who'd lived on this plantation called Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. And it is the only plantation which centers the history of enslaved people, not the plantation owners. So it's a really interesting arts-based and research-based center for thinking, museum for thinking about the history of slavery in that area. And it all happened because of Ibrahim. He persuaded the landowner not to use it for weddings and, nice occasions like all the other plantations do, but to turn it into a museum, to use his research to tell those individual stories. It's really great work that he's done. And that plantation, Whitney Plantation, is featured in the film 12 Years a Slave. So you can kind of picture it in your minds. Anyway, as we walked, he was sort of talking to me about what that work means to him and how he feels as a Senegalese man working on a former plantation. And it's quite a spiritual thing for him. He said it goes beyond the kind of rational, that when he's in that plantation, he can feel the ancestors willing him on to do the work. It's a life's work. It's really incredible, his dedication to it and how much influence he's had. And he also talked to me as we walked about the skills that people from the Senegambia region brought to Louisiana. The fact that they grew rice, which enabled the settlers to colonize the place in the first place and to survive, have something to eat. The fact that they knew how to grow indigo, so they were brought over for their knowledge of growing indigo, which was very important to that region at one time. So the first place that we walked to is, we started in this village of East Stratton, but we walked to this amazing place called Stratton Park. And really the Hampshire story of banking and slavery is connected to Baring's Bank. I don't know if you remember the story of the rogue trader, Nick Leeson, and so we kind of followed that story. And the original bank was known as the Baring Brothers Bank. And it's fascinating to kind of look into this more local history of it, but also to connect it to Louisianan plantations. So Francis Baring, who you can see portrayed there, was a merchant banker and a co-founder of the bank, and he later became an MP. And the Barings family was so important in the 18th and 19th centuries, but that they were known as the sixth great European power. So after France, UK, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Prussia, and then, of course, Barings Bank. So really, 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 really powerful. And as you can see, all that's left of Stratton Park is this portico, which we looked at from across the field. And the son of this Baring was Alexander Baring, also an MP. And it was him who arranged the 1803 Louisiana Purchase, which is known as the largest land sale in history. You can see the white on the map there, how much was purchased. And there were many consequences of that, but one of the consequences was that it allowed slavery to become more firmly established and in the southern Confederate states. And for sugar and cotton in particular to be grown there. But Barings Bank was important, not just because the Barings made a huge profit from this Louisiana Purchase, but also because they lent money to Louisianan plantation owners. And by the 1830s, a quarter of all their income came from cotton. So it's really, really important to the history of that bank. So we really wanted to explore that, starting in the village of East Stratton. Then we went to, as I say, Stratton Park, then moving through to Northington Grange, which was pictured on my title slide. Then we passed the church, which I'll talk about, St. John the Evangelist, then back through a little hamlet called Northington, and then back to East Stratton village. So this is Ibrahim walking with me we started off in East Stratton, as I was saying, and it was quite, it's a very, picturesque village. It's only small and it's got thatched roofs all the way along, except for the part of the picture that I've shown at the top. And Ibrahim was really fascinated by this thatch. And he saw, as we were walking along, there's a van with Jack the Thatcher written on the side. So he goes up to this man who's working on this thatched roof, and he said, "Are you Jack the Thatcher?" and he said, "Yeah, I am Jack the Thatcher." And they had a whole conversation about, African roofs and, how the method that was used and all of that. And then as we carried on walking past fields, Ibrahim was saying to me all kinds of things I would never have thought of. So he was saying, the land's so fertile, you could drop anything in this land and anything would grow. It would be really, really simple to make money here and to grow things here. And when he saw these lambs, he said they were so fat. He said if he took those back to Senegal, within a week they'd be thin as anything. So, we were having these kind of conversations about livestock and fields and things as we went along. And then we came to Stratton Hall and we looked at that portico, and he asked me what year it was built in, and I said, well, it was built. This is the one I showed you earlier. This is what it used to look like. And we were standing roughly where this image was produced, and I said, well, it was done in 1803, and he said, oh right, that's the year of the Louisiana Purchase, because they made $1 million around that time. And he also commented on its structure. He said, oh, it's Greek style, just like the plantation owners love in Louisiana. And then I was telling him that in 1803, in that year that the house was built, or the portico part of it, the really grand part of it, you can see from the Barings archive that Sir Francis Baring paid £2,000 for his wife's jewellery, that they spent £6,000 on furniture, and that they spent about £15,000 on art. So it kind of really all coincides, hard to pin it down, but coincides with that period. We carried on walking. Ibrahim is not really much of a walker. He likes his cars. He gives his car in Senegal, gives it a name, calls it Malou, after one of the. So he has Malou the first, Malou the second. It's kind of part of Senegalese history. And he said his feet were absolutely killing him. But we arrived at this other place, and this is Northington Grange, which belonged to Alexander Baring. And we were talking about how the Barings Bank financed also cotton's transportation from Louisiana to through Liverpool and to the East Lancashire cotton towns, where cotton was king, as they used to say. And how the Barings had established a Liverpool hub to allow all of that logistical thing to happen, and that's where they really started making so much money from cotton and transportation of it through loans and things like that. And also, there are some very evocative details about the Baring family and their long association with slave-produced cotton, because the grandson of Alexander Baring actually talked about how, with pride, about, and I'm quoting him here, that there were cotton bales marked with the stamp of my firm. So it kind of goes right down through the family for some way. But of course, for Ibrahim, this is, again, not just a collection of facts. It really, really means something to him personally. And even though he said his feet were dropping off, he walked all the way around Northington Grange just to contemplate and to think about his ancestors and what the connection was to this faraway place. And we then kind of sat down, had some food before carrying on, and we're thinking about Alexander Baring also as an MP and as a local landowner. And as an MP, he was always seen as, wrongly, as a neutral party on slavery, because he was seen as someone who didn't have any interest in particular in slavery. And he even described himself in Parliament as a sincere abolitionist. He said, I have always been a sincere abolitionist. But actually, if you look at the legacies of British slave ownership database, you can see that he made a compensation claim along with his banking partners in 1833 for someone who defaulted on a loan, who on whose plantations were enslaved people. And then in 1841, he and his partners actually owned more than 500 enslaved people in the Dutch West Indies, because the legislation to end slavery came much later there. And that estate was called the Upper Bethlehem Estate. And if you look at the ledgers and all of the information about those people who were enslaved in that place, you can see there's a column called Moral Character describing all these people on this list. And one of the people in this list is a man in his 30s, and he's supposedly of good moral character. But then when you look at the name of that man, his name is Baring. So you can see it there in kind of brown ink. But domestically, it's really interesting what was going on at this time. So around this house, there were swing riots and there was machine breaking because of what was going on in terms of labour history at the time. And Alexander Baring actually said that the protests and the strength of protest was exaggerated, but they actually attacked this house reportedly while he was still in it. As I say, just being in that place, I'm sort of, in a way, just coming to the end of my account of this walk now. But it was described by the architect as an idyll, and because I often thought, well, why did he settle there? It didn't look like a special place. But when you actually go there, you can see it's a very, very peaceful and restful place. And of course, Alexander Baring did spend some of his retirement years here in rest and repose, despite all of this history. And one of the fascinating things about it was written about this place by William Cobbett in his 1820s Rural Rides, who William Cobbett sort of talks about the overbearing trees, and you can sort of see the legacy of that on the estate, and how these overbearing trees told you everything about all this bloated wealth that was coming in from empire at the time. And on those grounds, Ibrahim was talking to me about the Confederate cotton fields, the history of Whitney Plantation, the monuments that they've put up to commemorate the children. There's a field of angels. There's some artwork commemorating a really violent insurgency. But at the same time, he always insists, that this is not just a story of bad treatment. It is that enslaved people from his region in Senegal defined the culture, they defined the music, they defined the cuisine, and they defined the economy. And that's something which is just still always unacknowledged. So kind of continuing on, we saw this enormous church. This is why walking is so useful, because I hadn't actually included this in my research. There's this looming church from this tiny little hamlet that's known as the Cathedral of the Valley. And you immediately realised it was built with Baring wealth. And the church, when you go in, it's got the Baring bears, which is a sign of the family on the doors. You can see them there. And it was built, not built, but paid for by the grandson of Alexander Baring. Just one of many sort of references to those times and that wealth. I suppose I just want to finish off by talking about, why it's quite useful to work in this way. So I went on another occasion on this walk, and I got Winchester Cathedral involved. So all the clergy and a lot of the congregation came on this walk, and we all walked together. We talked about history. We talked about what the history meant. And I think it was always important to think about what the history meant to Ibrahim and to communicate that as well. And it really is a more helpful spirit in which to discuss and share history. And there are so many references of Barings. As you set off on that walk, you walk past Baring Close and so on. They really do dominate that area. But I think, just to finish, I just want to say that I think it's important to both make these connections historically between labour history and slavery history, or as in other chapters, East India Company history and rural life back in Britain. But to do it in a really connected way and to think about it on a human level, to talk about what that history means, to do it respectfully, and to have calmer, evidence-based conversations about our colonial past. I'll stop there. I don't know if you've got some questions.